Greetings, dear listeners. Are you religious? It's a personal question, I know. But today's guest, the New York Times columnist Ross Douthat, believes that you should be. His new book, titled Believe, Why Everyone Should Be Religious, is a self-proclaimed blueprint for anyone trying to think themselves into religious belief. Douthat has been on our podcast before, and he is the author of several books, including The Deep Places, a memoir of illness and discovery, and The Decadent Society, How We Became Victims of Our Own Success. He is a sharp thinker and a great conversationalist. Before we get started, a reminder to head on over to wisdomofcrowds.live and consider becoming a paying subscriber if you're not one yet. You'll get access to, among other things, the whole conversation, along with other subscriber-only benefits. And don't forget to give us a like and review on your favorite podcast app. With all that out of the way, on to the show.
Called Why Damir Should Be Religious, but yes, that for others the subtitle is Why Everyone Should Be Religious. Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, pity we lost that. I hope some of that got caught on the tape. It was just starting. Anyway, take us away, Shadi.
So, Russ, I have to say I absolutely loved this book.
Oh,
I just told
you.
Damir earlier, I think it's my favorite book of 2025 so far.
So far.
We'll see. We'll see if that holds up. But I think I would highly recommend all our listeners and viewers to pick up a copy, especially if you're struggling with faith and you have doubts and you're on the fence and you're open to hearing more about a religious perspective. This is really a book that could change your life quite literally. And that's the level of ambition that I saw in your book, Ross. You really want people to take this seriously and maybe alter the course of their existence while they're still on this earth. So maybe a good way to start is not by asking you to give a summary of the book. That's a little bit basic, I suppose, but we'll get to all the different elements of your argument. But I think what struck me from the very start was you're making a different argument than maybe the one I expected. And I think many people, myself included, have increasingly made the argument that religion is good for you, that religion makes you more healthy, religion makes you happier and more fulfilled, religion makes it more likely that you'll get married and have kids, and getting married and having kids is correlated with higher levels of happiness. So it's a kind of data-driven case that even if you don't believe, act as if you believe. Do the ritual, do the daily practice, and then maybe God will help open your heart and you'll start to feel something. And I think that Karen Armstrong made a similar argument in The Case for God, where she says, religion is something you do, not something you think. Or the doing is more important than the thinking. But you come at it from a very different perspective where you say, actually, you know what? Forget whether it's good for you. You kind of take that for granted. And you say, here is why it's true. And you should start with belief and convincing yourself and being convinced. So maybe start there and tell us a little bit about why you took that approach and why you think that approach is a better one, at least for your purposes.
Yeah, I mean, first, thank you for the kind words. I really appreciate it. Hopefully, there will be no other good books this year, so that we can put that blurb on the cover of the paperback edition, best book of the year, without caveats. But yeah, I am coming at it from the angle you describe, and it's not because I think that necessarily the kind of try religion and see what happens advice is bad advice for everyone. I think that, human beings are incredibly diverse and interestingly so. And if it's good for people to be religious, then it stands to reason that there are a lot of different paths to religion that people might take. But I do think that for at least a certain kind of person, the kind of person perhaps for whom I'm writing this book, it is really important to have a sense of, not with absolute certainty, but a sense of the likelihood that religious claims actually hold together and make sense, before you can get them to plunge into the everyday practice of a given religious tradition. And I say that as someone for whom I think that's probably true for myself. I have sort of a variety of intellectual and biographical reasons for being religious, none of which relate to ever thinking to myself, this is good for me to do, and therefore I will do it independent of its truth claims. And I think personally I would have a lot of trouble with even the kind of de minimis practice of my own Roman Catholicism that I sometimes fall back into, where you're just getting yourself to Mass once a week, as the Church says you should. I would have trouble maintaining even that if I didn't feel like I had strong reasons to think that Roman Catholicism really does put me in some kind of relationship with a real being who really created the universe and really does have intentions for human beings that matter to our destiny in this life or the next. And again, that's me, right? And that it may be some listeners, but I think we're also there's also a way in which, for people who are actually religious who agree with me, right, who think that religion is quite reasonable and that its truth claims are not just some sort of leap into the dark, there still is a kind of embarrassment, I think, about saying that too forthrightly. So I think there's people who agree with me who are still more comfortable operating in the rhetorical landscape of, well, if you read Alexis de Tocqueville, it shows that the American social fabric depends on church going and so on, because that's the kind of language that our secular friends sort of relate to and understand. And I just think that's sort of self-limiting. And it's, and we're in sort of a weirder moment too, than we have been at other points in my career. So it felt like a good time to be more straightforward and say, there probably is a God, and you should take that seriously as a kind of first step.
Yeah. And what do you think about the argument that if you want something to be true, if you want it badly, that in effect it becomes true, that you can will yourself into it, that it's not about rational proofs or being persuaded, it's about wanting it enough?
I mean, again, for some people, that might describe some psychological mechanisms behind belief. I do think, though, people who are not religious believers tend to overestimate the power of that kind of move, because if you're not a believer and you think religion can't be taken seriously intellectually, and then you're trying to figure out, well, man, it's puzzling, why are all these people still religious, right? Then you sort of end up defaulting toward arguments like, well, there is this will to believe, this impulse toward belief, and people embrace it and sort of will themselves into belief. But even to the extent that that's true, I think you just as often can see, the opposite phenomena, where people who I would say might have good reasons for religious belief are sort of very self-consciously talking themselves into not believing, right, for reasons that are, that are in certain ways reassuring, right? I mean, I think one of the odd things, religion is presented as, it's the opiate of the masses, or it's, it's the big rock candy mountain, the pie in the sky by and by. And, obviously there is some fundamental reassurance in believing in the possibility of heaven or an afterlife or what have you. But just as clearly, there are ways in which, like, why do people, I cite this in the book, but why do people love the song Imagine so much, right? The whole, imagine there's no heaven, it's easy as you try.
The lyrics are really silly when you think about it.
The lyrics are silly, but I think they're also serious in the sense that, like, there is a lightening of burdens that not everyone, again, but some people feel in the absence of the idea of God. There's a lowering of stakes, right? If there's no God, if yourself is just an illusion foisted on you by your brain chemistry, then in our comfortable late modern existence, you can just sort of proceed as you're already proceeding, and it's probably okay because there's nothing to be gained, but there's also nothing to be lost. And I think there probably is something to be lost, and that's part of the urgency that you mentioned in the book. It is trying to persuade people, not necessarily successfully, but it is certainly trying.
Yeah.
But
and Damir, I'll just
go ahead.
Yeah. Also, I just wanted to state outright the title of the book, and we'll include a link to the show notes for our listeners. The book's title is pretty catchy, and it actually states what the book is about, which is always nice. It's called Believe, Why Everyone Should Be Religious. But what was striking to me is that it felt very relevant for me, and I'm already a religious person. I already believe in God. But I felt that it was fortifying my faith as I was reading it, and that my scaffolding was becoming stronger almost in real time. And I even thought to myself, there are things that I've been holding back on in terms of diving more deeply into my spiritual practice, that I'm like, I think I want to do it now, because Ross sort of gave me a nudge. And I'm Muslim, so it's not even Christian specific. You made me want to be a better Muslim.
Well, one of my friends joked that the real end game of this book is it shows up in the backpack of some jihadist terrorist someday, right? And everyone is like, oh, Douthat was a crucial step on the path to fundamentalist radicalization. So
that would be amusing. Yeah.
And
the other thing that I just wanted to raise is that while I felt really good about reading what I was reading, there's another side of me that feels that some of the arguments, for me, they're really obvious. And I do acknowledge that they're not obvious to a lot of other people, but I wanted to raise this and see how you would respond. That it seems so self-evidently obvious to me that God exists, because we go outside and we're like, it just seems incredibly improbable. It would have to be a very vast set of coincidences for all of this to work the way that it does, in a kind of perfect calibrated precision. And you see that wonder if you open yourself up to it. But you don't seem to have any of that kind of impatience with the non-believer. You take their reticence at face value, and you're like, you know what? You have legitimate reasons to be reticent, and I'm going to lay it out for you in this very patient way. And I'm wondering, as a believer yourself, how you're able to move past that kind of impatience and have this generosity of spirit where you're like, I'm going to meet you guys halfway and really lay it out for you carefully in a way that I don't think that I could. Because I'm like, come on, guys, how can you not believe that there's a God? And I'm exaggerating my own position slightly for emphasis here.
No, I mean, it's interesting. It's interesting that you have that reading, because from my perspective, this is a book written in a certain kind of impatience with atheism, with like hard atheism, not so much the uncertain agnostic, but the person who says there's almost certainly no God and it's silly to believe in one. And I do feel like when I think about my own personal shifts over the course of my adult life, I would say I've become, a bit less dogmatic in my specific religious beliefs. I'm still a conservative Catholic, but maybe a slightly less dogmatic one than I would have been 15 years or so. But I've become much more dogmatic in my anti-atheism. Like, I'm really sure the hard materialists are wrong, that, wherever Daniel Dennett's soul may be, hopefully in a better place, he was wrong, fundamentally wrong about the nature of human beings in ways that I think are fairly obvious. I think so. I guess I'm glad you think that the book is sort of generous and ironic, because I worried that I was wearing my impatience a little too much on my sleeve. I would say, I think the case for a certain kind of atheistic response to your view is just, God is in fact invisible, right? If there whatever God is, and here I'm, encompassing, very obviously there are many competing theories of what specifically we mean by God, but if you define God as some kind of conscious mind, intentional intelligence responsible for the existence of the world, we don't see him. Christians think we did see him, right, for a crucial few decades there, and so on. I mean, and different religious traditions think he manifests in different ways. But, it's true. We don't wake up every morning and look outside and see emblazoned on the heavens a set of clouds forming a pattern that says, God exists, mortal, bow down before him. That's true. And then beyond that, in some of the arguments I've had about the book, like, because it gets into questions of the supernatural and religious experience and so on. And supernatural experience, I think, is a commonplace of human existence. It's part of, it's part of why religion persists. It's not people willing themselves into belief a lot of the time. It's people having experiences they didn't expect that redirect them. But it is also the case that the strong miracles, if they exist, are rare, right? Like, it may be that, some Catholic saints and Buddhist monks have levitated, but you don't have hundreds of Catholic priests and Buddhist monks levitating every day in the year 2025 in ways that even Christopher Hitchens would have to acknowledge. So if God exists, there is some kind of hiddenness that I think pushes people towards a view that I've gotten in response, right? Where it's like, the default position should be, because God is invisible, he probably doesn't exist. And so the burden of proof is on the believer. And some of my non-believing reviewers and responses have said, look, Douthat makes some decent points, but he has a really high burden of proof to meet, and he doesn't get there. And just briefly, I mean, I didn't exactly say in the book, but I do think one useful way to think about what's being distilled in these debates is a sort of very primary question, like what is fundamental to the universe? Is it mind or is it matter? And all of religion comes out of the view, not all of religion, most all religion comes out of the view that mind is in some way primary. And from that you get to some form of classical theism, or at the very least pantheism, as a way of understanding reality. And I think people who assume that matter is primary are ignoring a fair amount of evidence for the ways in which mind is sort of resilient as a feature of existence, even given materialist premises. But I think that is sort of a useful way of conceptualizing the choice. Yes, God is invisible to us. Mind, however, is not. And the initial choice is not between the Christian or Islamic God and no God. It's between a mind as something we have access to in everyday life. Every day you have access to your own mind as the mode through which you experience the world. Do you think that's primary, or do you think matter is primary? And your answer to that question then, I think, determines the shape of your subsequent views of debates about religion writ large.
So, it's funny just listening to Shadi's points just now, and my reactions to the book. Maybe the book was written more for Shadi than for me, because like in my own sort of position on this sort of stuff is that I've never really been tempted by the materialist approach. I mean, I joke in politics that I do a lot of materialism, but I think like in these matters, the chapters on the question of mind and the sort of the neuroscientists' dogmatism about this sort of stuff, that's never really been convincing to me. I mean, they're great chapters of you demolishing that stuff, and definitely worth reading. I think it's really well done, but that didn't really impact me. And I'd love to talk to you a bit more about that stuff in a bit later, but I wanted to ask you a bigger question just here at the outset, and that's one about truth. It's a tension, and you even just sort of said something a little bit ago, which I found striking, that you become less dogmatic about your Catholicism, but more convinced, against the atheists. But the cost of that, and I mean, I think one of the moves you make in the book is that you at the outset say you're not making a case for even Christianity necessarily. You're making a much broader argument for the importance of religion and faith. So talk to me a little bit about truth claims, though. Do those matter? Should they matter in individual faith traditions? I mean, I think the book makes this move to say, in many ways, if you're open to religion, where you're standing, pick the one closest to you, do the practice, as Shadi was saying, embed yourself in it. But the truth claims of religions matter, don't they?
Yes, no, they absolutely do.
So just unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I'm making a move that that does leave me in a somewhat delicate position, where I'm trying to operate in a zone in between, on the one hand, a kind of religious or spiritual relativism that is quite commonplace these days, and is, I think, a not unreasonable move if you find general arguments for religion convincing, but look around at the diversity of religions, the diversity of religious experiences, and say, well, probably there's something real here that's showing up in all of them, right? Yeah. And so, choose the one you like, but don't think that it's, that it's the absolute truth, right? Or that it's the exclusive truth. I'm not saying that, but I am conceding that if you take religion seriously, it does appear that whatever divinity is, whatever the higher powers of this world are, they don't just operate through a single religious tradition, including my own. That, if you're looking at the varieties of religious experience, if you read William James or any of his modern updaters, you find all kinds of commonalities between religious experiences that are had by Hindus and by Muslims and by Catholics and by non-believers that sort of fall on people unawares. And those experiences are, again, not all, just as there is not, a single sign in the sky telling all atheists they must believe, all of these religious experiences do not feature sort of, recitations of Catholic dogma, right, being offered to the experiencer. But at the same time, the major religious traditions do make specific, distinct claims that cannot all be true at once. And in the end, which religious tradition that you end up in, you are making a choice. I would say, the phrase I use talking about Christianity is the idea of a controlling revelation. You are making a choice of the tradition that you think is the lens through which to interpret this wider landscape of religious and spiritual experience. And I think it's very hard to get around that. Christianity is is particular in this way, because it's not just making a claim about a particular teacher's teaching being correct. It really rests on claims about concrete historical events. In fact, that's one of the reasons that I say this at the end of the book, that I find Christianity particularly persuasive and powerful, is precisely that I think it goes further than some other traditions in grounding itself in a really concrete historical claim about God's action in the world. But yes, there is a way in which I think the serious believer reckoning with this larger landscape I'm describing has sort of two choices. He or she can either say, three choices. He or she can either say something that's sort of a pure relativism, that all religions are basically sort of groping at the same deep truth, and you shouldn't take their dogmas too seriously. Or they can say, as I would say, that you're looking for the truest religion through which to interpret all the others, but you are acknowledging that the others are playing some role in God's plan too. Or you can take a really hard line and say, one religion is true and the other religions are deceptions. And if you're a Christian and a Buddhist has a near-death experience that doesn't involve Jesus, that is a demonic deception, right? I mean, I think that is sort of the move that's available to someone who isn't, I guess, willing to be as relatively liberal as I am. I think it's almost certainly mistaken, though. I do think that. I think if you actually look at what religious experience is and looks like across cultures, it does look like the same, broadly speaking, the same kind of power is operating in different contexts.
I mean, I think that was what was striking to me. I mean, you said the L word, the sort of liberal approach. It is a modern approach, right? I mean, maybe I'm speaking out of ignorance here, but that's what the word that sort of kept coming up to me. I think you successfully navigate that and straddle that middle of the three options. But as a relative ignoramus to all of these matters, I was struck by that the tension between actual truth claims and sort of the ecumenical approach, which I think you're right is absolutely necessary in the modern context, that you need to take a step aside and say, insofar as that there's a higher power and insofar as we have evidence for it operating on humanity writ large and it's manifesting in different ways, it's the same thing. But that position also gets you pretty close to kind of that first position as well of that kind of choose your own religion thing. And it is something that quite frankly, there's another tension, not a tension in the book, but that really jumped out at me. It's very American, this idea that you pick your own faith tradition. I mean, you talk about it, how much of it's inherited and how much it's family. But this idea that you're choosing and thinking about this sort of stuff. I mean, I've made this point many times before. I'm Croatian, therefore I must be a Catholic. And that's just sort of the nature of the thing. You're Italian, you're going to be a Catholic. And that level of individual choice in this has always struck me as modern. But again, this is perhaps sort of a narrow thing of my own.
No, but I think that's right. But sort of, I'd say a different thing about the two sides of those points. On the second point, yes, this is absolutely a very American book in that it assumes a highly individualist culture defined by religious pluralism with no singular inherited religious tradition that is integral to your cultural identity. I would defend taking that American approach to religion in the 21st century on the grounds that I think that is what the future is for the whole world. As much as it might have been the case 150 years ago that the American approach was this outlier and the normal state of affairs was Croatian Catholicism, Italian Catholicism, Scandinavian Lutheranism, Islam in all its various forms in particular cultural contexts. I think the whole world is already partially Americanized, becoming more Americanized, and I think that forms of traditional religion that just try and root themselves in cultural inheritance are doomed. So I am, I'm not a trad exactly, but I am some kind of, I'm pro-traditionalism in some form, but I think traditionalism itself can only succeed if it assumes a kind of at least partially Americanized context. I think that has some applications to other parts of the world. We don't have to get too deep into the Islamic world, but I think if you look at successful Islamic movements in various ways of the last 50 or 60 years, they too are operating not in like an American style context exactly, but they are operating in a landscape of sort of persuasion and choice as well to some degree. Maybe Shadi would disagree, but
that's a good point. Yeah.
But to the first point, so I think it's tricky because I think there is a way in which, as a Christian, saying other religions contain intimations of God's purposes, that's not a modern view. That was that's a very ancient view. Early Christians were very comfortable sometimes they would, call the Roman gods demons or idols and so on, but sometimes they would talk about paganism, polytheism, and so on as containing seeds that were destined to blossom into the fullness of truth when Christianity comes along. And in part, my book is written in the spirit of something St. Paul says to the Greco-Roman pagans in the New Testament, where he says, look, I'm here to give you the final revelation of God's purposes, the full revelation, but there was already good reasons for you to believe in God, right? And, you already had good reasons to be religious. And so that has been a Christian position in certain ways all along. I think what is a bit where it gets trickier in a landscape of pluralism is you aren't just dealing with religious traditions that are sort of the old ones that Christianity is trying to supplant. You're also dealing with, again, to pick the obvious example, Islam, which comes along after Christianity. And I do think the traditional Christian view of Islam would be to say it is a demonic deception, right? Because it comes afterward, right? Yeah. I think that would, that would be.
Yeah, I think you're right. It just hurts a little bit.
Well, but
it shouldn't,
fair,
though, Shadi. Even for you, it shouldn't, right? I mean, it's this truth claims ultimately. Anyway. Sorry, go on.
No, I think it's fair. I think it would be fair for one of my fellow Christians to say to me, you are being too lax on post-Christian religious tendencies. And it's one thing to say God is present in different places before Christianity comes along.
Got it. Yeah.
But to say, he's still operating in non-Christian religions once Christianity is there on the table, that's a more liberal and move. And in that sense, I am making. I mean, this is the position of the position of the Catholic Church in the late 20th century is formally that God is present in Islam, and Islam in a stronger way because it's a monotheistic Abrahamic religion than in Hinduism, but it's also present in Hinduism and so on. This is not. I'm not expressing like heresy when I'm saying this,
right.
But I am expressing a somewhat liberal religious perspective on these matters, definitely.
So, Damir, I don't want to catch you off guard, but I do want to put you more directly in conversation with Ross on a couple things.
Sure.
Maybe, can you say a little bit about why you're not religious? And what is your own personal case for not doing what Ross suggests, which is individually searching among one of the many options and seeing if any one of them sticks for you? Why is that not compelling to you?
Well, I mean, again, it's difficult because I think that kind of, I don't know, misstates it. And what I was sort of joking at at the beginning when I said that just this conversation makes me think that you're better served by Ross's book than I am, is that, like, I feel like my default position is a skepticism that's not based in science. It's just a skepticism that's sort of, maybe because I'm like more trapped in my own head because I'm like an only child and have had, that kind of, I don't know, I'm just here. And but as a result, I feel like, most of the arguments from mysticism have always sort of resonated for me because, weird stuff happens. And the difference is, I guess, for me is that I'm not driven to figure out ultimate causes, which is why also the sort of scientific approach to it and all the claims for it are not compelling. I mean, I think, like I said, Ross, you do a really good job demolishing them, but they've never been compelling to me sort of from the beginning anyway. And so, I think listeners know, I'm in the process of actually reading the Bible from beginning to end, and actually from beginning to end, not exactly right. I read the New Testament, now I'm reading the Old Testament.
Typical Christian move.
Typical Christian move, exactly. Well, actually, my Christian friends told me to do it that way, so I was just like,
yes,
yeah, exactly.
They would.
They would do that, right? But and the funny thing about that experience has been, so again, what I'm getting at is like, the arguments from mysticism and the idea that it has to be a leap of faith, that all has always felt very intuitive to me. So that's why I was joking, Shadi, that you need more of a nudge to like take the leap of faith than I would necessarily. My problem is one of skepticism and sort of like one of other, I don't know, intuitive things for me. The big one having to do that I found actually very interesting in reading the Bible is the concept of predestination. I find that actually weirdly more compelling than anything else, which gets to a kind of, I don't know, I feel like maybe I'm just like out of step with time. I'm like pre-modern in some sort of weird way. But it's those sorts of things I find them more compelling. This notion that if there's a God, his will is unknowable, and the gulf between us mortals and God is just unbridgeable. Maybe, some intimations come through every so often, but this idea of I don't know, direct access to this and direct access to final ends, I don't know. I find that insofar as that exists in Christian tradition, I find it compelling. And all the other stuff that, the good life, meaning, ultimate ends, trying to come to grips with this, what does it all mean? That has never been all that compelling to me. So that's my answer to you, Shadi, but that gets us away from Ross's book in a lot of ways.
I want to poke on this. So
Sure.
Which is the just to clarify,
Mm-hmm.
the not compelling part of the religious perspective is the idea that from this sort of general mystery and uncertainty, we could distill a set of rules for living that we could say are probably what God wants. Is that what's...
No. I'm not a libertine either. It's the part that I feel most religious people try to get through is what Shadi was saying to one sense is either happiness and or meaning. And I guess I'm not thirsting for those is what it comes down to. This idea that
Okay.
or I'm not hungry for them. I feel like I'm okay, and I don't need that from the outside. What I find compelling about Christianity, or at least the Protestantism that I feel like I'm distilling from my read through the Bible, is this idea.
This is why the Catholics didn't let you read the Bible.
Exactly.
Dangerous book for the unwary.
And I mean, you mentioned again like the dangers. I think at one point of it wasn't directed at Protestantism, but it was directed at this idea of the dangers of sort of choose your own path and not sticking to a single tradition. Is that demonic forces and could take you down wrong paths in all of this. I'm just sort of remarking that the arguments from like ultimate meaning aren't that compelling to me. That's to answer your question, Shadi, about what keeps me sort of where I'm at.
Well, but why do you need? I mean, meaning and happiness. Obviously those are important in a way. But suppose you die, right? And you're summoned before the judgment throne of God, and God says, seems like you were sort of friendly to a bunch of arguments for being religious. You weren't 100% convinced. Why didn't you go to church? What would you say to God? Well, Who's present with us here right now? So
but would that conversation happen if predestination's true?
If predestination, so you're well. That's a separate. So you want to say that you're expecting to die and have not have a conversation, simply be assigned to an outcome.
I mean, that seems sort of plausible to me, I guess, in a way. But this is why I feel like discussing this too much will get into my weird psychological cul-de-sacs rather than anything more broad.
I'm just really I've had a lot of because I've been promoting a book. I've had a lot of different kinds of conversations, and I'm just always interested in people's stumbling blocks because since I'm making the book is making a kind of converging lines case for religion, right? It's saying there's not one slam dunk reason to be religious, but there's a lot of different reasons that add up, right? And when I have conversations, people usually have they don't have a single reason for being religious. They have sort of a singular objection, right? And maybe it's the problem of evil, or maybe it's the concept of God feels too narrow to capture the mystery of the universe, or maybe it's that they can't believe in the supernatural and so on. So I was just trying to get at like in your own head, your reason for not wishing to practice a religion. And
yeah, okay. I mean, the question of practice is an interesting one to me. The place where you talk about the importance of community and being surrounded by people, who do this and how that meets a certain human need. I take that point. I guess I'm not drawn to that part of going to church, for example. So like that level of practice. I mean, I'm not reading. To be fair, I've just been distracted ever since Trump's come to the presidency. There's not enough time to read, but
have you really?
I'm not.
Try releasing a book into the Trump presidency.
Oh man, I'm not reading the Bible as a just so story. I'm not just sort of looking at it as like, oh, an interesting cultural artifact. I'm reading it seriously and taking all of it very seriously. I think that where I come from in all of this, and this is what I'm getting at, why in some ways, I don't know, maybe I'm more spiritual than Shadi at a base point, while not being religious, in the sense that like I've always felt a kind of sense of wonder about things. My experience of, I don't know, all sorts of things, from music to art to just experiences of the world and nature and the rest of it, I've been filled with a sense of wonder. But that sense of wonder hasn't driven me to ask ultimate questions, I guess, is what it comes down to.
But why? I mean, stipulate like maybe there are certain ultimate questions that are beyond our capacity to answer. Mm-hmm. If you read the Bible, right, like one of the, especially since you're working your way backwards, this may become stronger as you go backwards, but I think it's obviously there in the New Testament as well. Mm. One of the things that's constantly happening throughout the Bible is that the Abrahamic God is instituting ways for his people to be in some kind of relationship with him. And these are structured ways. These are covenants. They are ritual practices, temples, and so on. They are, if you're a Christian, it's the institution. The crucifixion and resurrection is preceded by the institution of the Last Supper, which Catholics consider the institution of the Mass, and so on. Mm-hmm. So one of the things it seems like the God of the Bible is saying to you, Damir, mm-hmm. is, I want something, I want a relationship with you that goes like, it's nice. I appreciate that you feel this sense of wonder, right? But, come one step closer, mm-hmm. right? That's sort of what he's always trying. He's pulling, he's a jealous God, right? Like the Jews, the ancient Hebrews, they're always getting in relationships with other gods, right? And God is obviously angry about
and
that.
Bad things happen, yeah.
that seems to be, and you can reject. Maybe that idea is just sort of fanciful, right? That like the author of the universe wants a relationship with me. Come on, right? But that is, I think, one of the core things that religion, as opposed to spirituality, is saying to people is that, that it's not like religion isn't just, it's not there to make you happy per se. It is there. It does supply meaning. It should, right?
Yep.
But what institutional religion is doing is trying to mediate a relationship, no less than like a marriage mediates a relationship between a husband and a wife, except that here it's, a bit more unequal between the parties.
I take your point absolutely about ritual and how the covenant works, and I suppose that if I was to proceed down this path and embrace all of it fully, then there would be an obligation to partake in all of that. But again, the part that trips me up, that I don't find, and maybe this is again why I sort of latch onto the parts that Calvin seemed to have latched onto as well, are the parts where in fact we're completely powerless before the ultimate design of what's happening. And there's plenty of comfort to be had in that. Actually, a lot of comfort to be had in that, in the sense that the idea of, how do I put it? The free will that we have is incredibly bounded, or at least if you were even to zoom out completely, you would say that it doesn't even make any sense. And so even being called to recognize something like this, and that God is having a kind of conversation with me, that doesn't fully resonate for me. It would more be like, the way I'd conceptualize it if one was to say that I was on a path towards something. It's like, interesting. At this point, at age 48, he sat down and started reading the Bible for all sorts of reasons. It just sort of, it occurred that they converged and he's reading it now. And then, through that, maybe I get drawn to other sort of things. But there's never this, it's the question of the individual wanting ultimate answers and the rest of that I just don't find compelling. And it boils down to a sort of problem of free will ultimately that I don't know. Does that make any sense?
Yes. No. I am not a hard Calvinist, right?
Yeah.
But I do think that. With apologies to Calvinist listeners for this, vast generalization, I think that Calvinism is extremely philosophically coherent in ways that come at the expense of some of the kind of biblical texts that it's trying to defend. I think the Bible, yes, the Bible contains strong sort of emphasis on God's power that is in some way seems predestinarian, and that there's clearly some element of providential control exerted. At the same time, like all of the Gospels are filled with Jesus saying things like, be a better person, help the poor, right? Like that, all of Jesus's rhetoric and much rhetoric in the Old Testament implies a certain kind of agency, right? That has to, I think, and if Abrahamic religion is true, has to exist in some sort of relationship we can't quite understand with divine providence. I think I appreciate your theologizing this, though, because I've done some conversations. I did one with Tyler Cowen, in a few conversations where people will say something that's, they'll frame it in more secular terms, and they'll say, well, look, I've just sort of accepted that I don't have a religious temperament. Right. This is sort of the Tyler Cowen view of why he's not religious. He's interested in the arguments. He can go back and forth. But in the end, he's sort of content with his own non-religious temperament. And I think that kind of contentment makes no sense at all if you believe in strong human agency and free will. Who cares what your temperament is, right? If there's a God, you should be interested in him. Yeah. But it does make sense in a certain kind of predestinarian perspective, where it's like, look, God has given me this temperament, and he's responsible for whether I decide to go to church or not, right? I don't know. Maybe I don't know if I've remade Tyler as a certain kind of hardcore Calvinist or not.
Okay, I'll just say that this was fascinating to listen to, and I've learned more about Damir's religious and spiritual orientation in the last 20 minutes than in several years. So I do appreciate this. Thank you, Ross.
That's it for part one, dear listeners. There's a lot more where that came from. If you're not yet a paying subscriber, please head on over to wisdomofcrowds.live and become one. Help support our work. Hope to see you in the bonus.